Welcome to Film 5D, the show about everything film and video with the Sony a7S II. I'm your host, Aaron Hammock, and this episode I talk about the 5 most exciting features of the newly announced Sony a9. So, just in case you missed it, about 6 months ago I did an episode about my top 10 features I wanted to see from a potential new flagship camera from Sony. So let's take a look at the top 10 that I did back then and see how many I got right. Well, starting off right away, I got the name correct. I mean, thanks to SonyAlphaRumors.com for that. But for my number 1 and most important feature, a touchscreen, I mean, yikes. But moving on to number 2, dual SD card slots, which the A9 does have, in fact. And in my opinion, this is one of the things that the Sony Alpha lineup of cameras was missing. Professional photographers must have redundancy on their memory cards. I mean, can you imagine if you're shooting a full day of a wedding and you know, one of the cards gets corrupted that you were shooting on and you lose thousands of pictures that you can never get back? I mean, that would be, crazy. You really need to have that second card to, be redundant for the first card and copy everything over. And my number 3 was a 24 megapixel sensor. Well, actually it's 24.2, but I'd say that's close enough. And for number 4, the recording limit. And as far as I know, there's no limit here anymore, though this will of course need to be tested, especially when it comes to overheating in terms of how long the camera can actually record video for without shutting off. And number 5 was a brand new larger battery, which, this one is spot on. Sony has been touting about 2.2 times more battery life, which is very impressive considering that the body hasn't gotten that much bigger at all, really. Which leads me to number 6. I figured the A9 would be much larger than the A7, somewhere between an A7 and a Canon DSLR. And while the A9 is a bit bigger on the grip for a larger battery, the size is indeed, still very impressive. It's very small and light. Now for number 7, I had no more rolling shutter. Now this was a big wishlist item. The only real way to remove rolling shutter is to move from a CMOS sensor to a global shutter, and it was pretty unlikely that that would happen anyway, but it does have that new front-end LSLI and the latest Bions X processor, so the CMOS scan should be a little bit faster, kind of with the A6500 and the RX100 Mark V, but we'll see. Now for number 8, I had 10-bit video recording. Now unfortunately this isn't included, which really sucks in my opinion, especially with the new GH5 recording 10-bit internally. It would have been really nice if the A9 at least was able to push 10-bit through the HDMI out so you can get that 10-bit video recording on an external recorder like the Atomos Shogun. And for my number 9 on that list 6 months ago, I probably had the longest shot of a feature that we all knew would never happen. And that was a full-size HDMI port for external recorders and monitors. It just seems that none of these camera manufacturers, especially at this size, the small frame size of the full frame mirrorless cameras, will never want to go back to a large full HDMI port. Though the new A9 does have an Ethernet port, which is very head scratching to say the least. Now obviously the Ethernet port is for things like file transfers and the like, but I'd much rather have seen a full HDMI in its place, but maybe that's just me. Leave me a comment below with what you'd prefer. And my 10th and final prediction for the Sony a9 was to improve the autofocus system, and boy, this thing is not only fast, but it's also very accurate with more than 600 autofocus points, but more on that later. So not bad getting 7 out of 10 of those features right, and I even admitted at the time that some of my thoughts were definitely far-fetched, like that full HDMI and the rolling shutter not being existent anymore. But let's move on to my top 5 features that I am most excited about for this new camera and whether or not I plan on purchasing this $4,500 beast of a camera, or who might want to. Now, as always, just as a disclaimer, I do not own this camera. I plan to maybe get it and test it out in the future when it comes out, but I do not own this camera. This is purely based on specs. Some of you might not like that, but some of you might be interested in what I have to say, so let's get into it. My number 1 most exciting feature for the A9 is the 4K. I mean, why not keep with tradition and make the video resolution my number 1 feature as it usually is? Obviously, this can't compete with the 60 frames per second 4K of the GH5, but the A9, like the A6500, oversamples 6K and then compresses that image down to 4K without pixel binning and things like that. So you get a really high detailed image, which is awesome. I mean, if you've ever seen the A7S II and the A6500 side by side when recording 4K video, you'll see that the A6500 is much sharper and holds more detail with that 6K oversampling as this new A9 is going to do. Though, of course, it would have been nice to get the 60 FPS, I think that having the 1080p at 120 FPS internally is even more useful. Now for number 2, I think the new 693-point autofocus system is just incredible. It still remains to be seen, however, how well this will compare speed-wise with the a6500 and the RX100 Mark V, because those cameras have that 0.05 autofocus acquisition, but this definitely seems like it'll be, faster and more accurate, than most of the systems out there, especially on full frame cameras. This leads right into my number 3. In order to fully utilize such a high-end autofocus system, you need for the camera to shoot super fast, and I'm talking 20 frames per second on this bad boy, which to my knowledge is the fastest full frame camera on the market, which is just incredible, especially if you're a sports photographer, and I think that's what they're going for with this feature. Now obviously this is one of those features that is just going to blow away some professional photographers, and this makes the Sony A9 one of the more premier sports cameras, like I said before, moving forward. A market traditionally relegated in the past to Canon and Nikon, but it's great to see the DSLR killer Sony A9 here doing some work. And the exciting thing about this is that I think we're going to just start seeing the full potential of mirrorless cameras beyond just the size and weight advantages that we've seen in the past. Very exciting for us Sony users for sure, not to mention the blackout free viewfinder, meaning that you can shoot at that 20 frames per second, shooting sports or whatever, without missing a second of action, because the viewfinder will never go to black and it'll stay in live view the entire time. Something that a mirrored camera can't do, obviously. And for my number 4, as mentioned before, I really wanted more battery life, and the A9 delivers with 2.2 times more battery life and a bigger battery that really only widens the grip by a few millimeters. It's actually pretty impressive. With the A7S II, I consistently get about an hour of video recording depending on my usage scenario, but with the A9 you can expect to get at least 2 hours, which is a huge upgrade for sure, but we'll see how it is in practice. And finally, number 5 is the 5-axis in-body stabilization, which unlike the a6500 is completely inside the body and does not require an IBIS lens from Sony to get full stabilization on that 5-axis. We'll have to wait and see once this bad boy comes out to see how things like the battery life and stabilization actually work in real-world situations, but I'm definitely intrigued by these two features. Now based on the specs on this camera, this might very well be the DSLR killer everyone is touting it to be, and I can't wait for new iterations of this camera moving forward. In fact, I'm really hoping that they do the same thing with this line that they did with the Alpha 7 line, and that they introduce like an A9R with even more photography features, as well as an A9S, like an A7S, which sounds something like I would potentially buy because it would be more dedicated to videographers. Now having said this, I don't plan on buying an A9 anytime soon, considering that the only real features I care about for my workflow are the extra battery life, the higher detail 4K, and the double megapixel sensor going from my 12 megapixel A7S to 24.2 on this one. Definitely not worth the $4,500 price tag if you plan to mainly use it for video like I do. As always, I have links in the description below to some of the cameras and gear related to this video, as well as pre-orders for the new Sony A9, so if you'd like to support this channel, feel free to click those links below on any Amazon purchases. I'd appreciate that greatly. It supports the channel and helps out a ton. But that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this content, hit that like button and leave a comment below with your thoughts on this newly announced Sony A9. I'm interested to see what many of you think, and if you're planning on buying it. If you have any questions for me, shoot them over on Twitter at Filmin5D, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the logo on screen for more updates on my new videos when they come out. If you want to learn more about the new Sony A9, check out my blog on my website. Also check out my last video on my new Aperture LED lighting setup. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.